Hello, it's good to be with you again for our adult Sunday school lesson, and Merry Christmas to all of you out there. Whenever you are tuning into this, I'm sure it's going to be after Christmas. But of course, we are kind of extending those festivities out over the course of the weekend. And so the joyousness has not yet passed by us. It's a pleasure to be able to share this material with you this week, as it is every week. I'm kind of grateful that this year we have decided, or I should say, our lesson writers and editors have decided to kind of break with the Gospel Project tradition. And for the weeks of Easter and Christmas celebration, I guess, in reality, we're celebrating Christmas through this new rotation through the Gospel Project before Easter, that they're not doing dedicated lessons that are holiday specific. And I say that because it's kind of keeping us on track with where we are. But at the same time, what they are choosing to do for this week is break away from the progress we've made in the book of Exodus. If you remember, in our first quarter, we kind of did this at various points, at least in the first and third units. The last Sundays in those units, we kind of broke away from the lesson material we had been following, at least in those particular books. And we moved into something else to focus on a slightly different perspective, but mostly keeping in tune with the same topic. And so in a way, we are using a Christmas text, at least the passage that would form the third point, if we were following the points, I guess, but at least the third passage that we have available for us to talk about in this time that we have with each other, and that being from Matthew chapter 2 and the visit of the Magi as they come to see Jesus, right? But we want to continue to keep in mind something of the theme that we have been talking about, or several of the themes that we've been talking about over the last several weeks, a couple of months now, that we have been digging in to the Torah, the 5 books that are attributed to Mosaic authorship, right? So we're going to do that a little bit in our time here, and we're going to make, hopefully, some decent use of the material that we have available to us tonight or this morning or this afternoon, whenever it is that you have a chance to sit down and view this lesson. So we're going to read these passages, and we're going to come together for a time in prayer, and then we'll jump right on into studying, okay? So we'll actually be looking first in Lamentations, and to kind of give you something of a disclaimer up front, the book of Lamentations is really going to be driving much of our focus until right at the very end, in which we're going to pivot hard and we're going to look at Matthew chapter 2, but we're going to look at Matthew chapter 2 through the vein of Isaiah 60, and that, of course, will make sense, hopefully, when we get there. We're going to read Psalm 51, the first 2 verses, and I'm just going to briefly mention how they may tie into the focus of what I'm taking the theme that unifies these passages together to be, but we're really not going to be focusing on the psalm text at all. So I just want to kind of prepare you for that as we actually get into our time of study. So Lamentations chapter 3, verses 19 through 24. Jeremiah says, "Remember my affliction and my homelessness, the wormwood and the poison." Wormwood may very well be familiar to you, and if you're not sure where you know that from, you would find it in John's work, the Apocalypse or Revelation of Jesus Christ, as wormwood is given to the name of one of the stars or heavenly luminaries that fell from the sky and, of course, poisoned the waters. And the star's name, or the body that fell from heaven, was called wormwood. The wormwood and the poison, I continually remember them and have become depressed. Yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will put my hope in him. If you are looking at the Sunday school manual, the topic that becomes the title of our lesson has something to do with the faithfulness of the Lord. And if you've kept up with what we've been looking at over the time that we've been sharing in Exodus together, we've seen how the Lord has been faithful to his promise that he has made to Abraham. And of course, the promise is not only rooted in the Abrahamic story, as there are at least 11 chapters of material to cover before we get to Abraham's first mention in chapter 12. And while there is no promise so much as goes land and kingdom and various things like that specifically, yet there is a very broad and general promise given in the first 3 verses that opens chapter 12 of Genesis. Having said that, though, the Lord has been faithful to his promise in Abraham's lifetime, and of course through the tenure of Isaac on through Jacob. And as we've been reading in the last 2 weeks, to the descendants of Abraham, more specifically, I suppose, the direct descendants of Jacob, who had settled in Egypt during the time of the Joseph story and the closing chapters of Genesis, on through pretty much the first third, I suppose, of the Exodus story. And God has been faithful to the promise that he made in Genesis chapter 15, as goes what that story is bringing to bear with respect to the oppression and enslavement of Jacob's people, and how God has remembered the promise that he made in covenant relationship with Abraham to bring them out of that land, and in doing so, ending this exile, starting an Exodus that was meant to mimic and ultimately foreshadow the much larger scale Exodus that the descendant, the seed of Abraham, the promised son, Jesus, will ultimately lead. And that bleeds into the text that forms this much larger passage here. So just wanted to kind of speak to that for a second, because that is something of the backdrop of what our lesson writers wants us to focus on. So the Psalm passage, David says, "Be gracious to me, God, according to your faithful love, according to your abundant compassion, blot out my rebellion, completely wash away my guilt, and cleanse me from my sin." And it would do good for us, before we get into the lesson any deeper, to just be mindful of the use of David's terms here of wash away and cleanse me, that these are priestly terms. I won't say much on that here or now, but recognize that David, of course, when he is writing this, if tradition is true and serves us correctly, as this is attributed to him being written after his adulterous affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah, and after Nathan the prophet comes to David and condemns him for what it is that he has done. And then, of course, after the Lord opens David's eyes, not because David is ignorant of what it is that he's done, but hard of heart for sure. And with that, he certainly bore the Lord's judgment and in every way deserved it. But the Lord in his graciousness chose to forgive him after melting the hardness of David's heart through the convicting power of the Holy Spirit working within him, right? But while David is king during the time that he is writing this, he is praying to the Lord in this intercessory fashion for himself, and asking in this priestly manner that the Lord would wash away his guilt and cleanse him from the sin by which he has defiled his own heart. He has defiled the Lord's temple, even though none of this was done in the vicinity of the temple. But the idea is that the temple and the Lord's presence that remains there is meant to permeate the land. And so the temple is not static in the sense that it's just located on the summit of Jerusalem, which of course in David's time, there was no temple on the summit of Jerusalem. But when you read David's words in the Psalms, he is speaking about the Lord's temple where he dwells, and how that is intimately intertwined and directly connected to his presence on earth. And he has defiled the land with his rebellion, almost in the same way that Adam defiled the garden when he disobeyed the Lord in Eden. And he is asking that he be cleansed from this, and that the land, of course, obviously be cleansed from the guilt that has been incurred by virtue of his actions. And then on to Matthew chapter 2, but I'll just say this to kind of cap off what we've just read here in Psalm 51, is those themes are hopefully recognizable to us, if for no other reason than what we have talked about and reiterated extensively from the first look at Genesis chapters 1 and 2, and talking about how God had, coronated the man, Adam, to be king, commissioned him to be a priest in chapters 1 and 2. And that theme is not something that becomes shelved, if you will, for the rest of the biblical narrative. As I've said, the Lord continues to draw that out and build upon it at multiple points through the development of the Old Testament narrative. And this is just one of those places where we kind of see a combining of those offices and the relevancy of that theme once again. And it will become a bit more relevant tonight as we take a deeper dive into these passages. But for the sake of time, let's go ahead and read the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived at Jerusalem, forgive me, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star at its rising in heaven, and we have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and asked them where the Messiah would be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, they told him, because this is what was written by the prophet. They would understand, Micah. "And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, because out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And Herod secretly summoned the wise men and asked them the exact time the star appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. When you find him, report back to me so that I too can go and worship him." After hearing the king, they went on their way. And there it was, the star they had seen at its rising. It led them until it came and stopped above the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overwhelmed with joy. Entering the house, they saw the child with his mother, with Mary, his mother. Falling to their knees, they worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their own country by another route. If you'll bow with me for a moment of prayer. Lord Jesus, it remains to us something of a mystery how a book like Lamentations and all the gut-wrenching sorrow that Jeremiah, as this book is attributed to him through historical tradition and pastime, all that it is filled with, the thematic messages that resound in that book, and how that can in some way connect to the 51st Psalm. And of course, David, in a position like what he was experiencing at that time, is pouring out his own personal perspective of sorrow. And of course, the reason why the book of Lamentations was written, because of the destruction of Jerusalem, and that, of course, the direct consequence of the sins of the people. And David here lamenting over the death that he had brought into the lives of more than just Uriah, because of his abuse of power and his pride, his selfishness, and his committal to his vices and the urges that his flesh welled up within him. But yet how this connects to Matthew chapter 2 could be a bit enigmatic. And so I pray, Father, that you would help us to spend this time wisely and to understand, not feigning connections where connections do not exist, but to understand how there are many lines and threads of thinking and theme that connect these books together and are used to help climax in the ultimate hope that comes to light for us, that comes to life for us in the gospel accounts of your life, Lord Jesus. Help us to understand not only the relevancy, but what this calls us to and compels us to do. Help us to become even more grateful as we recognize with greater clarity what it is that you've done and what you have called us to and what you have privileged us with in working for and serving with, alongside, and under you. We ask this in your name for your glory and for our challenging and edifying sake. Amen. So I rather titled this lesson, as opposed to whatever our lesson writers chose to title it, "The Holy City of Our God." And I know at this point that might not make a lot of sense. And so I hope, not just for the sake of titling a lesson, but for the way these passages connect, or at least the way I think they may connect, that it'll make sense and help us make better sense, perhaps, of what is really going on in Matthew chapter 2. Okay. So again, we're going to spend some time in the first 2 chapters. We've already read from the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, but so that this outline isn't any longer than it already is, and that our lesson will go perhaps beyond an hour and a half, which is what they average. I chose to focus on verses mostly from the first 2 chapters and just leave the 3rd chapter in the constraints of the text that we read above, because much of what is said in the 3rd chapter and beyond is pretty much just echoing. Not to say it's useless, it's certainly not. There is much there to be mined, and many, many statements that reference other parts of Scripture that have come before. But alas, we won't have time to go through them here, and we really, as far as I recollect, won't have any time, maybe a Sunday somewhere, in which we'll get a chance to focus on Lamentations again more extensively than we already are here, perhaps. But I doubt that that's going to be the case. It's usually not one of those books that we have a chance to really cover in great detail with the way the Gospel Project writers structure our tenure in the Old Testament. Having said that, let's move on. So just looking at the first 3 verses that actually open up the short 5-chapter book of Lamentations, again, I was about to say historically attributed to, I should have said that, historically attributed to Jeremiah the prophet. You'll notice in many study Bibles, it will be structured in such a way that you can appreciate the acrostic design, that each verse correlates to a letter of the alphabet. We would say alphabet because that's of a Greek origin in and of itself, with the way that we have our alphabet structured, a combination of Greek and Arabic letters. But it's also influenced, as Arabic is a Semitic language, by an earlier Semitic language, and that being Hebrew in and of itself. And the Hebrew alphabet is called the alphabet because the first letter is aleph. The last letter is not bet, but bet is one of those letters. Anyway, notice, if you will, and I would encourage you to just go back and maybe read the first 2 chapters. It wouldn't even take 5 minutes really to do that, maybe 10, I suppose, if you're going at a slightly slower than average pace. But somewhere around the midpoint of each of those chapters, you'll notice something of a transition, because the first half of each of those chapters start with something of more like an objective outsider's perspective, at least a person who is writing this in something of the 3rd person, and speaking about the city, but the city of Jerusalem that has just recently underwent the catastrophe and the great calamity of the Babylonians coming through and ravaging the entire city complex of Jerusalem, and of course the temple itself. And if we read the scant extra biblical material that is contemporary to the time, as goes what the Babylonians did to Jerusalem, you'll find it is ever much as brutal as what the Romans did, nearly some 600 years later. But having said that, it's a terrible, terrible account. And certainly it's in every way pictured accurately with the poetic language of what Jeremiah is using in the book of Lamentations. But the first half of that chapter pictures the city as a person, a woman. But then at the second half of the chapter, it's as if the writer, Jeremiah, is picturing himself as the city. And you'll notice what I'm saying when you read various verses and it says something to the effect of my people within, or my priests. So naturally, Jeremiah is talking about not necessarily himself, but it's as if to say the writer has taken on the perception of the city and is sitting in the heap of ashes, wearing sackcloth in mourning over what has recently happened to her and how the city has been destroyed. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. I would like to use more examples to illustrate my perspective, but I think that you'll be able to make those connections if you go and just simply read the first 2 chapters and do so with the attempt to try to grasp that. Let's read these first 3 verses. How she, sits alone. Notice as you continue on through Jeremiah in later verses, it says Jerusalem has sinned grievously. The connection is clearly made here to the fact that the she in verse 1 is the city of Jerusalem. And of course, this is perhaps solidified even more so in the rest of this verse, but just to make it clear, while the city is not named, here in later verses it will be. How she sits alone, the city once crowded with people. She who was great among the nations has become like a widow. So it would behoove us to stop and to just try to picture with every one of these word pictures the depth of loss and grievance that the city of Jerusalem has incurred by the Lord's wrath and his hard-hitting hammer of judgment and justice that has befallen her. As if to say, a woman who has lost her husband and has now become a grieving widow, cloaked in sadness and mourning, so has the woman, the city of Jerusalem, become. The princess among the provinces has been put to forced labor. So imagine a princess, of course, being stripped of all her dignity and her royal bearing and privilege and being forced to work as a slave in a mining camp of sorts or some other position in which they are a slave, basically, because that is the literal nature of those who survived the siege that was brought by the Babylonians against Jerusalem are now having to experience, while the rest of their kinsmen are those who have been put to the sword and slaughtered openly in the precincts of the city and the surrounding fields. She weeps bitterly during the night with tears on her cheeks. There is no one to offer her comfort, not one from all of her lovers. Now, of course, you read the rest of the prophetic language given by people like Hosea and so forth. And this is speaking of the level of spiritual adultery that Jerusalem, not only Jerusalem, but both the kingdoms of Judah and Israel at one point were subjecting themselves to, and of course, forcing the Lord to watch as he was postured in the language of the prophets as being the sole lover, the husband of Israel. And of course, they had prostituted themselves with the nations. So having said that, through what they had done in their political alliances, and of course, by embracing and adopting the hedonistic and heathenistic, two different things, hedonistic and heathenistic practices. Hedonistic in the sense of embracing passion and expressing that passion in this heathenistic way, the paganistic way of worshiping other gods that Israel had no business subjecting themselves into. No comfort from all of her lovers, because of course her lovers care nothing for her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile following affliction and harsh slavery. She lives among the nations, but finds no place to rest. All her pursuers have overtaken her in narrow places. And reading a little further, a few more verses that Jeremiah gives here in this chapter, Jerusalem has sinned grievously. Therefore, she has become an object of scorn, which is the very thing that Moses in his sermons in Deuteronomy, in the very quick fashion that he gave them as he was preparing them to cross over Jordan and begin this conquest period, is reminding them of their history, their storied past, of what's happened over the last 4 decades since leaving Egypt and wandering around in the wilderness, waiting for a generation of rebellious traitors to die off so that they could step up in their place and hopefully do what their forebears should have been willing to do in going into the land underneath the Lord's guidance and letting him subdue the land before them. But of course, they didn't. And he is encouraging them not to be hard-hearted and allow disbelief to cripple them as they did. But of course, he's also telling them with grave reminders of not only what has happened, but using that as a backdrop to picture or foreshadow what will come in the future if they act in any way like their forebears did, or allow themselves to become transformed into the very peoples of the land in Canaan that are about to be kicked out once they go across the Jordan and start this conquest of conquering and subduing the land and eradicating the evil that has continued to perpetrate and tentacle itself out, permeate the land, and defile it in terrible ways in the centuries that the Canaanites, since the time of the flood and the generations that spawned from Noah's sons afterwards, has been filling this land with. Remember Genesis 15, the sin of the Amorites has not yet met its full measure. Well, now that's happened, right? And the Lord is using his people Israel to cleanse the land. But Moses reminds them in Deuteronomy, if you act like them, if you become in God's sight like the Canaanites are, that God will use foreigners to come and kick you out of this land. The land itself will vomit you out. And when that happens, you will become, as it says here, an object of scorn. Well, now that has become the living reality of the descendants of Jacob 1,000 years later. Her uncleanness stains her skirts. Notice here, uncleanness, of course, can in some way be attached to this priestly concept of how the tabernacle or temple setting of the Lord is supposed to be kept clean. And of course, it will over time, by the sin of the people, become tainted gradually. And that's the reason for the Day of Atonement mentioned in Leviticus 16, is to cleanse the temple, cleanse the tabernacle space where the Lord meets with his people, his dwelling place amongst them, the very nexus point where heaven and earth meet together in this scaled down model of the Garden of Eden that was meant to bring back to life basically what had been lost in Genesis chapter 3 with the action of the first man and the first woman. And we've made those connections plenty of times over in the weeks past, but just to make sure we understand, they are still at work here. Her uncleanness, though, while we're talking about some measure of impurity, which makes a person unfit to come before the Lord in that tabernacle setting, at the same time, it is in a real way kind of picturing the idea of a woman's menstrual cycle, and how the idea of blood leaching out from the body is a symbol of life leaving the body, because the life is in the blood, as we're reminded in the words of Moses in the book of Leviticus. And as life leaves the body, obviously that's a process in which death ensues, albeit for a brief period of time. When a woman is undergoing a change like that, it's meant to stop, and of course life is restored again as what blood was lost is replaced. But the idea, of course, is that whereas the sanitary means that women have now to prevent the staining and soiling of their garments were not available to women in these ancient periods. So it would certainly stand to reason that they would recognize the imagery here that Jeremiah is using. And remember how Hebrew is a very strongly engendered language. So cities are almost always, or usually exclusively, referred to in the feminine sense. So thinking of Jerusalem as a female, and how through her menstrual impurity, the blood leaching out of her body has stained her skirts. That has now created a sense of uncleanness for the once chaste and pure virgin daughter that was Jerusalem, espoused, married unto the Lord. All are people grown while they search for bread. The Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah like grapes in a winepress. My children are desolate because the enemy has prevailed. So on the left side of the rest of our columns, to the rest of the document, I'm going to continue to work through the Lamentations material, chapter 1 or 2. And on the, hopefully I said right side. I can't, please forgive me if I said left. I didn't mean to confuse. On the right side of the screen, Lamentations material, or other places that I might choose to pull from. But on the left side of the screen, other passages that usually precede the Lamentations work that helps remind us of what the focal point of the writer in Lamentations may very well be, and perhaps some of the inspiration that he's drawing from. Now, I'm going to kind of follow a tangent, and it's going to eventually come full circle as we close in on the Matthew 2 text, as we speak about the concept of city, the city of our Lord. But there's a few things that we need to be reminded of. So I'm going to try to explain that here. And I want to try to make sure I'm keeping these thought concept and construct straight. So let me just briefly summarize it here over the next 2 minutes, if I can. But if you go back to what we talked about in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, remember that we were speaking on the idea of the fact that the reason why those chapters in the creation accounts are orchestrated the way that they are is not to explain to us the how of God's creative work, but the why of God's creative work. And it is in many ways a parallel and on par with the thought process of ancient Near Eastern creation myths, not borrowing inspirationally from those to shape their own personal narrative and to kind of fit that in there in the scheme or the landscape of all the rest of those nations that Israel would be firmly embedded amongst, to say, hey, we've got our own gods, albeit it's a God for us, gods for you guys, and our own story for how all things came about, just like you guys have. But to set straight in the minds of these Israelites who had spent centuries down in the oppressive enslavement of Egypt, and may have had some concept of an oral history and connection to their patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, again, centuries before them that have passed away now, and who they are and where they came from, and who the God that covenanted with their patriarchs is. But we have no record of that. We can't really say for sure that's what's going on. But Moses is working through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit to set straight in their mind who God is, the God that has watched over them like a shepherd, and while he has allowed them to endure this exile, is now calling them out of this. But he is working to purge the influence of Egypt out of them, and any other influence from other nations such as Babylon or Samaria or Canaan that they have been exposed to, because Egypt being a trade partner with many of those nations. And who knows how deep and pervasive that influence was in their hearts and minds, is working to help deconstruct that and help them understand, working through the material that they are familiar with from those creation myths, that the Lord is the one who has actually created the cosmos. But many of the details are different, as goes, there is no attribution of or deification of certain things, such as the river in Egypt, the Nile, and it being governed by a god or a goddess, or that there not being a god or goddess that governs the cycles of fertility, whether we're talking about human procreation or if we're talking about the crops in the field or any of these things, that it's God who has created these rather inanimate objects, or the other things that they look around and see shares life with them, but of course are not representations of heavenly deities, and are not meant to be mascots of sorts of them, but of course represent the very glory of God in a very tangible way, as they can see it and they can appreciate it, but they realize it is separate and distinct from God in every possible way, as much as they are separate and distinct from those other things. And with that, we also see that in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, the way that those creation accounts are constructed, it starts with the primordial waters and eventually ends with God bringing order to the chaos and dry land from the primordial water that is meant to kind of be seen like a mountain. It's not constructed that way for us so much in the Genesis account, but when we borrow from other passages in Scripture, we can see that that's the model that's in place, namely Ezekiel chapter 28, which I have for you on the screen here, in the idea that Eden was a garden planted on the side of a mountain. And there's a lot of other topographical features mentioned, and we'll jump into that here in a second. But at the top of that, where that garden is, this becomes the prototypical temple sanctuary where God and man met together. And there's the blending together of God's space, heaven, and man's space, earth, at this nexus point, because we have heavenly creatures mentioned for us, cherubim that are there in the garden. Other places of Scripture would seem to suggest that there were other members of the divine council of the Lord there in the garden as well. And man walked in God's presence, and God with man in his presence, right? And so all of that together is blending these images for us to help us understand and see there's a lot more at play here than just God making things, all right? When we talk about Israel and her development as a nation, this is bringing all of these themes back into the direct center of the focus, or as the focal point of the story itself. The idea that God has brought this prototypical temple sanctuary of Eden back into the reality of his people, a covenant people and race that God has brought forth through the man he brought from the exile of the nations, Abraham, to start this process of bringing the rest of the nations in exile to himself through a full-on kingdom of priests, Israel, that he has made from this one man who was childless until God called him. And that nexus point of Eden is supposed to be recapitulated and resurrected in the temple, before that, the tabernacle construct in and of itself. So we're going to be looking at lots and lots of language like that. But of course, that is supposed to be the capital portion or part of the city of God that is foreshadowed by what Jerusalem is in the Old Testament, but grows into a much larger theme in the New Testament. And that's where Matthew chapter 2 and the birth of Jesus is taking us to. So I'm going to just kind of quickly run through the rest of this stuff to kind of lay down that concept a little more firmly in our minds. But if you notice the inspiration of what the psalmist is saying in Psalm 11, David says, the Lord is in his holy temple. Now, of course, you and I, when we read that, we're thinking temple on the summit of Jerusalem with God's people and his nation surrounding him right around the time of Solomon or shortly thereafter for the next 500 or so years, right? But of course, if David is the one who actually wrote the psalm, then there's something else at play here, because the tabernacle itself was never erected in Jerusalem. So he's not talking about that. And if we're talking about the idea of a temple in the way that you and I normally would think of it, creating that mental image in our minds, the temple does not exist at this point, and it won't until David is dead and Solomon takes over as king, right? So when we're talking about the Lord in his holy temple, we're talking about the Lord on his throne in heaven. I really can't think of a better image here that brings this home in the Old Testament other than Isaiah chapter 6, because Isaiah is in a vision inside the temple. He's not allowed to go in the temple, at least not in the deep spaces of the temple, the innermost sanctum of the most holy place. And that vision is taking place right there in front of the altar where the coals of burning incense are there in front of the innermost curtain, where the Lord's presence is just on the other side, above his footstool, the Ark of the Covenant, right? But there, as Isaiah is seeing the Lord, he is seeing him in the temple, and all he's really getting here, of course, is something of the image of his feet and the fringes of his robe, the train of it that begins to fill the temple, and he can see above the throne, but he doesn't really get to see everything that happens in that middle portion there, as it's kind of obstructed by the cloud of incense. But he sees those seraphic creatures flying above the throne that are crying out, holy, 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 right? So the idea there is that heaven, God's space, and earth, man's space, are melded together in this image that he sees in the innermost sanctum of the temple itself. And that is exactly what that space is supposed to do, is bring God's space and man's space together at a nexus point, okay? So if we're thinking like that, then what we should be visualizing here in our minds is, think of the way that the first two chapters of Genesis creates this construct in our minds of primordial earth, dry land, mountain shape, and up on the top, God's temple that reaches up into the heavens, where God's space and man's space come together. If we're thinking like that, then we're understanding the bead, the train of thought that David is operating with here. The Lord, his throne is in heaven. His eyes watch, his gaze examines everyone as he's looking down that mountain to all humanity that live below and around, right? Again, it's a poetic construct. It's not meant to be taken literally in the idea that this is the way we are to see it, as if to say this is the way that David thought the world actually operated. David's clearly aware of the fact that topographical features around Jerusalem, while Jerusalem is a high plateau area, it's not quite like that. But notice here in Psalm 18, he goes on to say, I called to the Lord in my distress. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. I've used this passage in recent weeks to also parallel the idea of how David, in speaking about how the Lord delivered him from all of his enemies, is using Exodus language, the very language of what we saw happening at the Red Sea and the crossing of the people through the water, and how David is speaking about how his own exodus and the deliverance from the grips of Sheol, the grave, its cold, icy fingers in the form of his enemies trying to snuff out his life and prevent him from doing what God had commissioned him through the anointing of Samuel to do. God had preserved him. And now through the end of those struggles and trials that had lasted for many years, God has allowed him to emerge victorious, but all glory, of course, being given to him. But David is speaking about how when David felt himself being almost in danger of being cut off, how he is slipping into the waters that represent Sheol, the chaos that is about to consume him, and how the Lord up on the top of that mountain from his temple, that nexus point, heard his cry and delivered him out from that, right? As he said, he heard my voice and my cry to him reached his ears. Another place, Psalm 48, God, within your temple, we contemplate your faithful love. That is reminiscent of the first two passages from Lamentations and Psalm 51 that we read earlier at the opening point of this lesson. But of course, the psalmist writing this is reflecting not only on the idea that an actual temple may stand, and it's a place where God's people are allowed to come to an extent, as goes the outer courtyard. Priests are allowed to enter in to the furthest most points on the inside, but it's meant to be a place where they appreciate God's willingness and desire to want to walk amongst his people. And it's there where they perhaps may feel the closest connection to him. That becomes something of the inspiration behind the way the prophets will be writing and speaking about. And of course, later Psalms that are written during the period of the exile, speaking about the longing and desire to want to be restored to the land that they were pulled from, because that's where God's temple is supposed to reside. But nonetheless, they do feel a connection to God, as his temple transcends a hard stand building. They understand that concept. It's not lost on them, but yet it's something that they deeply desire. And we are reminded, of course, of the Genesis chapter 2 material. And we'll touch on that here in a second, but I don't want to leave these verses behind here because Jeremiah goes on to say in Lamentations chapter 2, he has thrown down Israel's glory from heaven to earth. He did not acknowledge his footstool in the day of his anger. The imagery here is just to speak about how heaven and earth were connected in a very real way, albeit perhaps not in a way that's visible to the eye, but is appreciated in the imagery, and God's filling the temple space with bringing fire from heaven on the day that Solomon dedicates the temple, and mass sacrifices conducted all around, not just on the altar, but at several points within the temple compound itself. And God ignites all of these sacrifices by bringing his holy fire and his presence from heaven to ignite those carcasses and consume them, bringing them to himself as a savory offering or a pleasing aroma with the burning of those animal carcasses and so forth. And all of that was meant to represent, going back to the Mosaic text from Leviticus, where we're speaking about, or where he's speaking about in the first mention of these offerings, how these were meant to be brought to the Lord to please him. And of course, it's in that very book itself where the dedication of the tabernacle is completed, and the Lord does the same thing. His glory fills the tabernacle at the end of Exodus. And when his priests are installed, after their consecration ceremony is over with, God ignites the sacrifices on the altar to consume them. We'll talk about that also here in just a second. But nonetheless, the idea here is that this is what Jerusalem is supposed to represent, with the temple construct and all now fully functional and operational. But the idea is it's become defiled. Through the last 1,000 years that the people have been in the land since the time of Joshua up until now, and granted, they've only had the temple for almost about 400 years or so, or perhaps I should say 500 years, I'm sorry. No, I guess it has been 400 years, that it's never really been living up to its potential at any given point in time. The broken history from the time of Solomon all the way down into the end of his descendant, Zedekiah, who is the very last of the Davidic kings ruling and reigning in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar comes knocking on their door. It's just been a tragic, broken story, one after another, with the exception of one or two decent kings who walked in the shadow of David and attempted to try to follow his ways in pleasing the Lord. I should say following his example, but nonetheless, this is the reason why God is purging the land. And he is not acknowledging his footstool, and he is creating the distinction between heaven and earth as he is casting them down from this lofty place. He has allowed them to be elevated. He's bringing them down to the bottom of that mountain as he is allowing chaos, the waters, to come and consume them. And we'll touch on that briefly here too. Remember, again, just using the Ezekiel imagery here, that Eden, the garden of God, was on the holy mountain. It's meant to be seen like a holy mountain, lifted up off the flat plane of the earth, if we're looking at the imagery the right way. All right, going back to Genesis chapter 2, we're reminded that the Lord planted a garden in Eden eastward, as the opening of the garden is facing in that direction. And through the surrounding vicinity, that is the actual area known as Eden, and this is just a garden planted in that provincial area of Eden, there's a river coming out of Eden and into the garden space, right? And it eventually divides, becomes 4 other rivers, and it's in this sacred space, this prototypical temple sanctuary, that the Lord has planted the man. Remember the connections that exist in Ezekiel 47, when from Ezekiel 40 all the way through 48, Ezekiel is speaking about this magnificent temple complex that is supposed to be built in Israel's future. And of course, I, like many, maintain the idea that while this is very specific in dimensionality and functionality, yet a lot of this is just reminding Israel of the greatness of the future that lay ahead of her from the moment Ezekiel is writing these words down, not speaking of an actual literal point in her history where she's going to have this grand, magnificent temple complex, but through the words of Haggai, the prophet that comes after Ezekiel, some years later, when the people go back to the land and they are building a new temple, but it's nothing like the one Ezekiel describes. And he says that the glory of this temple will be greater in the future than its predecessor, the temple that Solomon had once built, but not because Herod is going to expand upon it in his days, the very Herod that's the one that we read about earlier in the Matthew 2 text, but rather he's speaking about the idea that the terminus or endpoint of God's temple is actually divorced from the idea of a hard stand building and becomes a temple that it consists of God's people. And that's the very theme that the New Testament writers take up, right? But nonetheless, we know that it's not a literal temple from Ezekiel 47, where he says, then he brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and there was water flowing from under the threshold of the temple toward the east, because the temple in its opening faced the east, just like the former did. The water was coming down under the south side of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. And of course, it becomes a mighty raging river that eventually empties out into the Dead Sea and transforms the sea to become a sea filled with life. But the idea here is it's hearkening back to this Genesis 2 imagery of there being a river in the garden, and it's creating several different parallel points there that speak of how basically in Genesis 2, this was a garden temple. Now you ask, why does this make any difference here? Because this is the source material that the writer of Lamentations is pulling from when he's speaking about, as through the few verses that we've just looked at here, the Lord has cast his people out. He has judged them. And of course, the imagery that he is using here with describing the city and so forth, and what the city's significance was supposed to be as being the nexus point where heaven and earth and God and his people meet, like Eden was in Genesis chapter 2, is hugely significant. And if we don't capture that, then we don't understand and appreciate the full extent of what the author is driving at. When we go to chapter 2, verse 3 of Lamentations, Jeremiah says, God has blazed against Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything. Perhaps part of what serves as the inspiration that he is using here to kind of capture the image of what he means by that, as this, of course, is a measure of judgment. We go back to the Leviticus text, and we see in chapter 9 of Leviticus that at the end of that chapter, we just referenced this a second ago, the consecration of Aaron and his 4 sons as priests. And as the offerings are made and everything is set in place, then fire came down from the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. When the people saw it, they reverenced the Lord greatly, as they all shout, and then they fall down on their face to worship the Lord. That chapter ends here, and the very next chapter opens up with Aaron's 2 oldest sons, Nadab and Abihu, taking their own fire pans, putting fire from perhaps another source that's not authorized to come from, not the incense and the coals that are offered on the altar right before the curtain that separates the holy place from the most holy place inside the tabernacle itself. And in doing so, they, of course, profane their offering before the Lord, and the Lord judges them by allowing fire to come out from him and consume them, and they die. And if this is indeed the inspiration behind what Jeremiah is writing and picturing here that's going on here in Lamentations 2, then perhaps what he's speaking about here is that the very kingdom of priests that the people of Jacob were supposed to become have now become an object of scorn. Instead of being the intercessory priests they're supposed to be on behalf of the nations, they have become just like the nations. They can't intercede for people, but they are mimicking in their actions and profanity, as goes the way that they have continued to walk in their own ignorance and rebellion against the Lord. So Jacob's people are doing the same. And by virtue of that, God is blazing his fiery wrath out from himself toward them in the form of the Babylonians under the headship of Nebuchadnezzar, their king, to come and consume them, right? And then we move on to verse 4. He has strung his bow like an enemy. His right hand is positioned like an adversary. Perhaps something of what's going on here. I'm not saying this is definitive, and I'm certainly not trying to be dogmatic about it, but maybe an area of connection or a theme of a point of connection that we can make here may go back to the actual Genesis account of what happened at the end of the flood, and how the Lord, when he is covenanting with Noah and he's bringing back into the center point of focus the covenantal terms he had made with Adam, but he expounds upon it a little bit. And we get this image of the Lord putting his bow in the clouds. And of course, we see that in the imagery of the rainbow. But the idea here is the idea of a warrior taking his bow, his instrument of skill, and of course, what he uses to strike his enemies down with, and putting it up on the wall, retiring it, if you will. His bow will be in the clouds. He'll look at it, remember the permanent covenant that he has made with all living creatures on the earth, not to bring a flood to destroy every living creature. You might say, well, if that's the case, it can't be the inspiration of what Jeremiah is using here. That's not the case. When he says in verse 4 of chapter 2, he has strung his bow like an enemy. His right hand is positioned like an adversary, because he's not consuming the whole earth, but he is consuming his people. He is bringing judgment like he did in the days of Noah against his own people when he is allowing the chaos. Again, if we're thinking about temple, mountain, the dry land of Genesis chapter 1, primordial chaotic water kept at bay down here. But in Genesis 6 through 8, when God allows this chaotic water to come up and consume the earth and covers up all the dry land, and everything is submerged underwater, just like it was at the beginning of Genesis chapter 1. And then, of course, God undoes all of that in Genesis chapter 8, leading into chapter 9, creating a new habitable space for those contained in the ark. God is doing something similar to that through the judgment cycle he's bringing upon Israel. But before he gets to this point where he brings a remnant out of that to start again a new creation, he is, of course, going to allow the chaotic waters in the form of the nation of Babylon coming to consume them. And God is going to be leading the charge at the head of that, right? And God in Genesis chapter 9 is saying his desire to consume humanity will not be something that he exercises again in the future on this scale, but he is doing it on a much smaller scale with the nation of Israel. Verse 5 from Lamentations 2. The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He swallowed up all its palaces and destroyed its fortified cities. Maybe something that's inspirational here goes back to the rebellion of Korah in Numbers 16, where he, from the family of Levi, wants to be on par with both Moses and Aaron in the positions they get to serve in. And he is leading a rebellion against them, thinking that he has every right to join in with this priestly work, not Levitical work, but priestly work that Aaron and Moses gets to share in as well, because Moses has some intercessory and priestly roles in the beginning of Israel's tenure as a nation, as they are formed as such at Sinai. And just as he finished speaking, this is Moses, these words, the ground beneath the people, Korah and all those joined in him with his rebellion, split open. The earth opened its mouth, swallowed them and their households, all Korah's people. They went down alive to Sheol with all that belonged to them, and the earth closed over them, and they vanished. And notice here how fire also came out from amongst the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were presenting the incense. So here we have basically a recapitulation of what had happened with Nadab and Abihu, because these other men who were not authorized to offer incense before the Lord were doing so in their censers, and the Lord punished them the same way he does Nadab and Abihu. And maybe if this is somewhat inspirationally connected to what Jeremiah is saying here, with the idea of Israel being swallowed up, all of its palaces and fortified cities, we could think of it in several different ways, but perhaps the ground opening beneath and them slipping down into Sheol. Sheol is the realm of the dead. And that, obviously, through this picture of judgment, many people would be caught up in this conflagration, and they too would die, literally die, slip down into the grave, to the abyss that exists below the land, outside the land, as goes the chaotic primordial waters that is always kept at bay, but still threatening to consume the ordered creation that God has brought forth from it that exists on the dry land. All of this is meant to deconstruct the sanctity of what God has made of his new people, Israel, that is meant to bring the experiment of Eden and God's man, Adam, in Eden, and Israel being a new Adam of sorts, that is supposed to fulfill this job of being God's king and priest, ruling over the nations and interceding on the part of the nations and helping the nations walk in the light of God's wisdom and counsel as they work to try to reconcile the nations back to God. They failed in that, and God is judging them because of that. As he judged Adam and kicked Adam out of the garden, pushing him out of his presence, so now Israel is suffering the same fate. Verse 6 of Lamentations 2. He has wrecked his temple as if it were merely a shack in a field. I'm pulling this from the CSB, Christian Standard Bible, but the Hebrew rendering of this phrase here is actually literally, he has wrecked his temple as if it were in a garden. So think of that connection. That directly takes us back to Genesis chapter 2 and Ezekiel 47. He has destroyed his place of meeting, because that's what the temple is, just like the Garden of Eden was. The Lord has abolished appointed festivals and Sabbaths in Zion. He has despised his king and priest. Why is it that Jeremiah focuses on both of these offices of king and priest in his fierce anger? It would seem to reinforce the connection back to the Genesis story all the more, as Israel being a new Adam of sorts, and the original man, Adam, put there in the garden, was supposed to fulfill that. And of course, Jeremiah, the one penning these words in Lamentations in Jeremiah 4, recognized that his work is not chronological in sequence at all. And so some parts, right at the beginning of the book, are already looking toward what will happen when Babylon comes and destroys the entire kingdom of Judah, and of course its capital city of Jerusalem with its temple. And the way he describes this picture is basically a complete undoing, a systematic undoing of what God did, and is described by Moses in Genesis chapter 1. I looked at the earth, it's formless and empty. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. I looked to the heavens, they're gone. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it's only proper he would connect the two. I looked at the mountains, the dry land that God had brought from it. They're quaking, they are crumbling, the hills shake. And of course, the crowning moment of creation is the man that God put in the garden. And there is no human being. And remember in Genesis chapter 2, there's dry land, but there's no vegetation. There's no rain to bring forth crops. There's just a light mist that comes up out of the ground. And there's no man to work any of this, because God has not yet created a man. And when he does, he then plants a garden and puts the man in the garden. There's no human being. All the birds in the air, they flee. All the fertile field, the green vegetation is gone now. It's like a barren, desertous wilderness. Cities, these population centers that create the organization where men are supposed to come together and worship the true living God, as pictured with Jerusalem, and of course the cities of Judah, they're all torn down because of the Lord and his burning anger. It's as if to say God has upended creation, flipped it upside down, and it's all been torn apart, right? But now this is where we actually begin to get into the Matthew chapter 2 material. Before I do that, let me just sum up everything that I've tried to bring our minds to. The focus of the book of Lamentations is to describe what has happened with this terrible calamity of God bringing horrific judgment upon Jerusalem, the people of Judah. God has already done this nearly 120 years before with the 10 northern tribes that formed the northern kingdom of Israel, because of the centuries worth of rebelliousness that they continue to exude. Once they broke off from the southern kingdom of Judah, they never followed the Lord. And the 20 kings from Jeroboam the first all the way to Hoshea, the last king, none of them were righteous. They were murderous, rebellious, treacherous thieves that continued to vie for power, steal power, and do everything they could to please and satisfy themselves rather than obeying the Lord. The closest one who was somewhat obedient was Jehu, but he, of course, exceeded his mandate and became all just as rebellious as those who had preceded him, and his sons were no better than he was. And so now Judah, while they were a light that God left, a small flickering lamp that was something of a memorial to his servant David, God is allowed to continue to exist, and 20 kings after David arise. But of course, some of them are good, some of them are not, and eventually it leads to just a continued proliferation of apostasy until eventually they look just like the nations around them, and God has decided to enact the very judgments that he had warned through his servant Moses would happen. In fact, this is exactly what the writer of Kings speaks about when he ends the second volume of his work, speaking about how God has brought judgment. The very words of Moses were brought to bear here as God has wiped them off the map. He has caused the land to vomit them out. God's city is no more. It is a burning rubble, an ash heap. That is all that is left. Where is the sense of hope then? When God's people, those who were allowed to survive this, have been carted off in chains, basically to a new Egypt, now in the form of Babylon. They were delivered from slavery centuries and generations before, now only to return to that very thing, as was foreshadowed by Abraham coming into the land in Genesis 12 after his calling, and several years have passed. And then eventually, as he goes through the land and he sees the famine there, he decides to go into Egypt. And it foreshadows the idea that when they arrive in the land in the conquest period headed up by Joshua after Moses, eventually they're going to go back into exile. They're going to go to the very place that Abraham was called out of exile from, Ur of the Chaldeans, there in Mesopotamia, the very plain of Shinar, where Babylon as a city exists. So they go back there in oppression, or under oppression, into enslavement. And while they're there, they have the promise of God's future deliverance of them. But then again, the very idea, the scandal of how God would have allowed this to happen to them is what is burning in their minds. And no doubt they have even had false prophets, rivals such as Hananiah, who tried to argue against the words of Jeremiah and said, no, the Lord will deliver us. He is going to smash the yoke off our necks by humbling Nebuchadnezzar, and he is going to allow us to be victorious. He is going to bring us back from the land. The exiles that have already went there, he's going to deliver them back here to the land, while Jeremiah is writing a letter telling the people, don't think that. Don't believe those words. That those are false prophecies. They're not prophecies at all. In fact, settle down, give your sons and daughters in marriage, and pray for the peace of Babylon and the king, so that you will be able to live and flourish while you're there as he lives and flourishes there. Right? So who do you believe? What do you trust? And in all of that, when they see it can slowly plays out the very way that men like Jeremiah and Ezekiel had been speaking about, then doubts perhaps begin to swirl. And the thought process of, will we be like our ancestors were in Egypt when God brought us there? And at first we were flourishing, and then eventually we wind up becoming slaves, despised by the Egyptians, and we are as meaningless as those babies that were thrown into the Nile to be drowned. And it's only in the process of time when they start to get to the end of that 70-year period, or roughly 70-year period, that they have to wait and see, how is God going to manipulate the circumstances to allow us to become favorable, or to favor us, so that we then can experience this new exodus that he has promised us. But the hope of the prophets is the light that is supposed to be peeking up over the far horizon, that's getting closer and closer with every passing year. And of course, with that is the dawning of the Messianic age and the last age, in which when God brings his people back to the land, and he brings this new Moses, this new deliverer, this Joseph-like figure who in the mantle and vein of David is going to rule and reign over them, is going to usher in a period of unprecedented prosperity and a peace that will permeate the earth, as Jerusalem is the city of cities and the epicenter of all life on earth. And Israel has become the preeminent nation. This is what they're looking for. And when we get to Matthew chapter 2, this is what's going on here. Even though we have a passage of these wise men, what is sometimes referred to in some translations as the Magi, who are coming to witness the birth of this messianic figure that had been prophesied to come to the Jews, and of course will launch a kingdom that will touch all the nations and affect them in a very positive way. And we have this paranoid king by the name of Herod, and of course he is known to antiquity as Herod the Great, who is seeking this very child himself, albeit for different reasons. And how this story ends with these distant travelers who come seeking this child are allowed the privilege, being guided by the Lord through this star. We say star because we're not exactly sure what this was. It was a heavenly luminary of sorts that guided them over a period of time to the very place where Jesus lay, and them unpackaging their wares, these gifts that they had prepared for him, very specifically of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But there is so much more going on here than just distant travelers paying homage to the holy child that has been born. And I want to draw to light here the prophecy of Isaiah in Isaiah 60. Let me read these verses to you first. Arise, shine, for your light has come. Remember, in the poetic language of prophets and psalmists and so forth, definitely in Lamentations, we've already witnessed this, how an entire people group or a city can be pictured as one person, all right? For your light has come, and the glory of the Lord shines over you. For look, darkness will cover the earth, and total darkness the peoples. So here are the nations, the peoples that surround this particular point of focus, that have been consumed in darkness, that has overshadowed them, covered the earth as it is, and all lands and peoples outside of this one spot where the Lord's glory shines. But the Lord will shine over you. The backdrop of what's going on here, or what we're supposed to see and appreciate, is Jerusalem. Your study Bible may even say that as a subscript or a footnote of sorts. And his glory will appear over you. So imagine a beam of light coming down out of the sky over the city of Jerusalem, while darkness continues to enshrine the land, or I should say enshroud the rest of the land and the peoples and all the rest of the earth. Nations will come from the darkness to your light, kings to your shining brightness. Raise your eyes, look around. They all gather and they come to you. Your sons will come from far away, your daughters on the hips of nursing mothers. Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will tremble and rejoice, because the riches of the sea will become yours. The wealth of the nations will come to you. Let's pay attention specifically to these final verses. Caravans of camels will cover your land. Young camels of Midian and Ephah, all of them will come from Sheba. So we have very specific geographic details of cities, tribal lands, if you will, where rulers and kingdoms have been forged in the ancient past, from Isaiah's point of reference when he is actually speaking these words. They will carry gold and frankincense and proclaim the praises of the Lord. All the flocks of Kedar will be gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth will serve you and go up on my altar as an acceptable sacrifice, and I will glorify my beautiful house. And of course, we would think of the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. And certainly the very city of Jerusalem, again, is what Isaiah is speaking of. Now, from Isaiah 40 all the way through 66, which ends his compilation of oracles, all of that is post-exile in focus. This is when the people of Israel have left Babylon, Persia, and those lands, those holdings that were controlled by these pagan emperors, have now come back to the land of Israel, have begun the process of rebuilding and reestablishing Jerusalem and her temple and so forth. but it's speaking about the yet to come and soon to dawn messianic age that will soon be what these people, albeit it will still be perhaps hundreds of years, but it will soon come about. But now, as it goes, the idea of how this directly relates to Matthew chapter 2, you may have already seen the direct connection here of gold and frankincense. But I just want to bring to light the idea that when we think about the journey of the Magi, many of us are familiar with terms that have crept in over the years that I won't say are not accurate. I can't be dogmatic about this because we have differing sources and, of course, differing terms that we have to consider here. And whose tradition do you follow? We're talking about a story that's 2,000 years old. But the word magi in Roman and Greek literature contemporary to the time in which these New Testament authors would be writing the accounts of Matthew and Luke, the only two gospels that give us birth narratives of Jesus, that word would normally be referring to people who come not only from the East, but the Far East, namely from Persia. And this is where the traditions of three wise men, these kingly figures, not saying they are kings, despite the fact that Christmas Carol seems to suggest so. And of course, sometimes they're given names such as Balthazar and Melchior and whatnot that come and offer these treasures to Jesus once they finally see either the infant or the toddler, however we're supposed to understand that, given the age of the children that Herod have ordered his soldiers to put to death when they go and storm Bethlehem that fateful night. But while we would be accurate in seeing that term magi as being descriptive of people from that area, the idea is, what exactly are these wise men doing as goes their profession? And we would appreciate from the way other people have described what the star may have been, whether it's an actual star or whether it's a compilation of planets inside a collection of stars that we would call a constellation, and how these are working synchronistically with each other to create a very luminous object in the sky that would shine down upon the area where Jesus was to guide these wise men to the place where they would find the young child. That's probably more accurate than just simply appreciating the idea of a special star of sorts. But again, we can't be 100% sure, as we don't have anything that verifies this for us. But if these people are those who look at those luminary bodies up in the skies, and they are considered to be wise men because of their craft and skill, Persians are not the only ones who do that. The Egyptians have been doing that for hundreds of years. Eventually, other cultures will learn to do the same thing. And there are people right in Israel's backyard, if you will, who do the same thing. In fact, in the 1920s, a British scholar by the name of A.F.F. Bishop was surveying some different communities and tribes around the eastern side of what we would now call the land of Israel, because it had not been established as the land of Israel at the time. It was still Syria, Jordan, and what is often referred to now as Palestine. But on the eastern side of the Jordan River, in the land of Jordan, or country of Jordan that we call now, he was actually interviewing and surveying the past history of a people, a Bedouin tribe known as the Al-Kokabani. And the prefix of Kokab, K-O-K-A-B, means planets. And the Al-Kokabani are those who follow the planets. And what he come to understand from this Muslim tribe of people is a very proud and rich tradition in which they claim the idea that their ancestors who came before them are those who, while Arabic and not Persian, and there is a definite difference between them, and a distinction that is clearly upheld today between the Saudi Arabians and the people of Iran, who are the descendants of the Persians. And while they are both Muslim, they have a lot of opinion about each other, as goes the Arabic and Persian distinctions. But nonetheless, that these Arabic Muslim Al-Kokabani, those who follow or study the planets, were those who actually went and observed the Christ child after his birth and delivered up these offerings of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And you might say, well, that's great that they claim that, But a lot of people could claim such a thing. And how do you really contest it when we're talking about a tradition that goes back nearly 2,000 years? But, perhaps the most ancient witness we have to this outside of the New Testament itself is the words of Justin Martyr. And he was a man who lived in the 2nd century and around AD 160. In his dialogue with Trypho, the very name of the books that commemorate his written debates with Trypho, who was a Jew that lived in Alexandria, that he actually spoke about in 5 different references in those works, how the Arabs were those who came to attest to the birth of Jesus and offered the offerings of gold and frankincense. And we actually maybe have something of a biblical precedent to back this up. And I'll get to the reason why this is important here in just a second. But if you go to 1 Kings chapter 10, we know that the Queen of Sheba, and we have here a direct connection to all of those who will come from Sheba, is the one who, after Solomon is done with the building projects of the temple and his palace, she is the one who comes with this massive entourage of camels and so forth, because she has heard of Solomon's fame and his wisdom, and she has come to test him with difficult questions. She comes to Jerusalem. Of course, this again is the nexus point of heaven and earth, and the temple that has just been built there to re-image the Garden of Eden and all that is meant to be connotated by that. And when she comes, not only is she bringing spices, frankincense, but gold in great abundance. Why? Because there we have evidence to this day archaeologically of gold mines that were there in the precinct of Sheba. If you're not sure where Sheba is around the area of modern day Yemen, which is the country right at the bottom of Saudi Arabia, what would be called Arabia in the ancient past, right? So she brought truckloads, if you will, of gold to Solomon as an offering. So Sheba would be a place where gold is mined and of course could be transported from. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of other passages here from the New Testament to try to tie this in. But what I want you to think on here is the idea that as opposed to Persians, maybe Arabs being the ones who bring these offerings of gold and frankincense, but when they're bringing them, that's not really the point of emphasis I want to make here is who was it? What I want to draw out here is the overall meaning of what Isaiah is speaking about. Because as he is presenting this oracle, it seems like what he's focusing on is the darkness that is enshrouded the people around the vicinity of Jerusalem. That he's speaking about the adornment of Jerusalem that lies in the yet still future point of these people who have come back to build this city. And he's speaking about how God is going to allow his glory to be manifest there as the shining light that beams over them. And that, again, speaking about how they will be enriched by the wealth of the sea and the nations being brought to them. That the people of God, his covenant people of Israel, will be brought in, escorted by kings and on the hips of nursing mothers to be restored unto this place. And the nations will appreciate this as well, right? That is what's supposed to happen. And he will glorify his beautiful house with all of these things as they bring gifts of gold and frankincense, proclaiming their praises. But if Jesus as Messiah is the fulfillment of this promise, then while Isaiah is speaking of Jerusalem, there's not a point in the gospel at all when gifts of gold and frankincense are brought into the vicinity of Jerusalem and offered there at the temple. God does nothing to beautify his house as goes glorifying it with his presence in a manifested way like he did when he filled it when Solomon dedicated the temple. That doesn't happen, at least not in a way until you get to the book of Acts, but we're talking about the Gospels, right? It seems like what's going on here is that while truckloads of wealth are not being brought to the vicinity of Jerusalem and God's people are not being reunited and restored here in the land of Israel in Jerusalem itself, and Jerusalem becoming the city of cities, rather the focus is being drawn off the city itself and being thrown onto Jesus. And whereas in many of these poetic passages, Jerusalem is spoken of as a daughter or a woman, now that paradigm is somewhat flipped. And now Jesus becomes the city. It's as if we've taken the concept of a person being a city and a city being a person and applied that terminology to Jesus. And Jesus now has become that nexus point where God's holy mountain, as pictured in the plateau of Jerusalem, rising high above the earth, where his palatial palace of the temple being built, where God met with humanity, and namely through the intercession of his kingdom of priests, Israel, has now been kind of reestablished. And even though Jerusalem is a city, the temple is there, it's thriving with people, yet they still feel the oppressiveness of their Gentile rulers ruling over them, and there's injustice in the land, and many people are upset and not happy and waiting on Messiah to come and deliver them from all of this. And he has come, and he is coming to deliver Jerusalem from all of that. And he is coming to reconcile the nations, ransom them out in a new and final exodus and in the exile that has kept everybody enshrouded in darkness, as Isaiah speaks about. But it's not in the way that they think about. And he has become this focal point of God's city, where his glory resides and shines over. He is the light. In fact, this is the very way that Jesus is presenting all of this as he speaks of himself in places like John chapter 7. But before we even get there, we have very good, I think, a very good grasp, or at least we're supposed to, on the theological reasons why Jesus had to be born of a virgin, to break something of that cyclical pattern of sin manifesting in the sons of Adam and the way that we are linked directly to him. But I just want to say, is it possible that when we get to places like this here, of what Jeremiah is saying in Lamentations 1, the Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah, this kingdom that is supposed to be espoused to him as his bride, but is also pictured here as a daughter, that perhaps a part of, I'm not saying the reason, but just a part of the complex nature of the reason why Jesus is born from the virgin womb of his mother, Mary, is because Mary, in a kind of typical way, is foreshadowing or connecting directly with the imagery of Jerusalem and the people of Israel being the conduit by which Messiah comes into play, and the mantle that Jesus is taking on as the guiding light to the nations, which the prophets speak of Jerusalem as being in the future. But they do so with this very personable language of it not being so much a people, but a person as referenced with the term of Jerusalem. That the virgin daughter of the Lord, Mary, and I don't mean that in a directly relational way, the way that we have a tendency to think sometimes with respect to the Greek hero tales of old, right? Of gods having intercourse with women and creating demigods and so forth. Not at all, but rather the idea that Jesus is born of a virgin because Israel was supposed to be a virgin, a chaste woman that was faithful only to the Lord, rather than a prostitute who harloted herself with the nations around her. And of course, Mary was virginal until her son was born, but it speaks to the purity of his character and nature as the Messiah who would come from her. Just a loose point of connection, if you will, not something to really, I guess, geek out too much over, because I don't want to strain the point. But back to John chapter 7. Think of the idea when Jesus is in Jerusalem, the festival is already half over, and this is the festival of shelters. This harkens back to the time of the Exodus from Egypt, when the Passover happens, and then, of course, they leave the land, and then 50 days later, they're there at Sinai receiving the revelation that God gives through Torah. And after a year, but of course at Sinai during that year, but certainly after that, when they nomadically wander through the wilderness over the next 40 years, they live in tents. The Feast of Shelters is where they leave the comforts of their home and built ramshackle shelters, if you will, out of sticks and boards and whatever else that they can throw together. And they, for a week, live in these structures to mimic the journey of living in exile apart from the land in these shelters, and then the coming into their own homes, kind of mimicking the conquest era when God brings the Exodus to an end under Joshua's headship, and they enter the land and seize it and conquer it and begin to set up this kingdom for the Lord. It's during this period that Jesus in this festival celebration goes into the temple, beginning to teach. And then this passage stretches all the way into John 8, where in the time of this celebration stands up and says, I'm the light of the world. Now, there are many Old Testament images at play here, like the pillar of cloud by day, fire by night, that lead the people through their wilderness journeys. But it's the very thing here that Isaiah is also using to speak about in the darkness and the focal point of light upon Jerusalem. And here Jesus is saying, as he's standing in the temple, which is supposed to represent the nexus point of heaven and earth, and saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Or in another place, in John chapter 10, when the Feast of Dedication, what we would call Hanukkah, taking place at this time of the year, was taking place in Jerusalem. It's winter. Jesus was walking in Solomon's temple, or I'm sorry, in the part of Herod's temple, which is called Solomon's colonnade. And of course, he is being accused here of the things that because of the things that he has said by the religio-political leaders for blaspheming. And he is saying, you say that I'm blaspheming, but you're saying this to the one who the Father has set apart. The whole Feast of Dedication was during the time of came about during the time of the Maccabees, when their Greek Seleucid overlords were attempting to basically outlaw being Jewish, period, and making every expression of that, even the most minute, punishable by death, and were successful for a period of about 3.5 years until the revolt led by the Maccabees began, and when they were able to wrestle control of Jerusalem away from the Seleucids and drive them out and back northward toward their capital city of Antioch, then they, for a period of about 150 years, were able to establish a Jewish kingdom independent from any Greek influence in the land at all. And when they started to cleanse the temple, they didn't have enough oil to keep the oil or lamps of the lampstand lit in the temple itself, but it stayed burning for a period of 8 days, longer than it should have. They considered that a miracle in and of itself. And this feast of Hanukkah, of dedicating the temple back to the Lord and cleansing it of the profanation that was brought about by the way that the Greeks had forced them to offer unclean animals on the altar as sacrifices. The dedicating of the temple back to God, its consecration away from the unholy and profane to become holy and clean before the Lord. Jesus is saying that he is the one who the Father has set apart, basically as a new temple, the nexus point of heaven and earth. We've already seen him reference this very thing in John chapter 2, when he said, if you want a sign, consider this, destroy this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days. And John tells us clearly he was speaking of the temple of his body, right? And it's more than just the idea that he is the temple. He is the city. He is the very thing that Isaiah was speaking of in Isaiah 60. We get a better concept of this when the writer of Hebrews is telling us in Hebrews 12, you've not come to what could not be touched, to a blazing fire, to darkness, gloom, and a storm, and the blast of a trumpet, the sound of words. The imagery of Sinai, when God came down and his space was touching man's space again, it was something of a nexus point of heaven and earth meeting again as God's people. Israel, the new Adam, was there with him, right? But they were not allowed to come into his presence past a certain point, because if so, his holiness would break out against them, even though they were clean and able to come at least that close, but no further than that. And he is saying instead, you are, it was so bad. Moses himself was saying, I'm trembling with fear, but instead you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, right? Where myriads of angels and a festive gathering has all met together. The nexus point of heaven and earth, Jesus. Galatians 4, Paul, in this allegory he's giving of the difference between Mount Sinai and Jerusalem, Mount Sinai representing Hagar, and of course Jerusalem representing Sarah, and vice versa. The idea is that Mount Sinai is a place where bondage is seen, clearly in the imagery of Hagar being the bond servant. Jerusalem, the one from above, is free. She is our mother, right? He's speaking of this heavenly Jerusalem. But perhaps it becomes most profound when we consider the imagery of John in Revelation 21, the words of the apocalypse. John saying, I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from God. I didn't see a temple in it, because the Lord Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. All of these images are meant to be clearly seen in the vein of what Isaiah is speaking about, with the idea of these caravans. And notice here, it's not just those who, like the Al-Kokobani, are the ones who study planets and would recognize the signs in the sky above, as goes the star, being seen at its rising and coming to visit the Christ child where they would find him laying, but also shepherds. Caravans of camels will cover your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah. And of course, those are tribal lands directly to the north of Sheba, right at the southern edge of Jordan, where when you get out of Saudi Arabia and into Jordan, right at the top of the Gulf of Aqaba of the Red Sea, right there, that's where Midian was. And of course, where Moses had lived for 40 years, where Mount Sinai is located. So here in this backdrop of what Isaiah is speaking here, both Matthew with the visit of these wise men, perhaps from Arabia, and of course with shepherds that Luke draws upon, and these are shepherds in the direct area around Bethlehem. But of course, maybe something of the inspiration that he is drawing here from Isaiah 60 being brought to bear here is what he is using to describe the very concept of the nations bringing their offerings of obeisance unto the city of Jerusalem, now being pictured as the Christ child being born. And how does this become important for us? Because God in his faithfulness has not abandoned his people. But the hope of the people of God is not a renewed Jerusalem in the physical sense. It's not a re-glorified or a newly glorified Jerusalem in the physical sense, that as many people are sadly anticipating the idea that someday in the future, God is going to topographically reorganize the entire area of the world where Jerusalem stands, so that Jerusalem becomes literally the highest summit or mountain peak above all the mountains in the world, or that a literal temple will be built there from which a physical river that has never existed there before will suddenly break forth from the threshold of the temple, which somehow I would think kind of makes it almost impossible to enter into the temple, because we're talking about the innermost sanctum of the temple, coming out from there, going eastward and down into the vicinity of the Dead Sea area, right? But nonetheless, while people hold to these literal representations, what it's meant to poetically image is the complexity of who Jesus is as Messiah. And those promises seen in a physical light take on a whole new meaning, not in an allegorical way, and not in an overly spiritualized way, because to say that these are spiritual promises means or kind of suggests the idea that they are completely stripped of any physical meaning whatsoever. But yet Jesus was in every way physical. You could touch him before and after his resurrection. To us, of course, as non-Jewish people, it might not seem so much of a difference or a big deal, the idea that we're not talking about a newly renovated Jerusalem, but rather the idea that Jesus is the fulfillment of these promises, whereas a person who is ethnically Jewish may be waiting for such a thing. But this is where the Lord, through the wisdom of his illumination and opening our eyes to the understanding of what these promises mean, help us realize that these promises hold a far greater point of fulfillment and connection in Jesus than these physical promises that really don't mean anything at this point, as goes the idea that we're waiting on something like that. Because if we understand that he is the city, he is the temple, and that he has brought us in to become a part of this new Jerusalem that is meant to blanket the earth, this temple that consists of living stones, and this is the hope and fulfillment of all the prophets are speaking about. And of course, it might be simple sounding when we kind of summarize it in such a way, though we are using New Testament language and not making up terms or phrases of our own when we say such things, drawing from what Paul and Peter are saying off the inspiration of what's already laid down in the Gospels and the words of the prophets that have come before. But what we appreciate in this also is a very clear and keen understanding that this has global implications. It's much more small scale and small potatoes when you're thinking about a city. You're thinking about a real building like a temple that is geographically limited and isolated to a place where people have to travel on pilgrimage to go see. Whereas in this way of thinking, it permeates and fills the whole world and is meant to influence the world everywhere God's people are, because God's covenant people, in the way that Israel was, consist of not only those who are ethnically Jewish and embrace Jesus and follow him as Messiah, bowing the knee to him as Lord, confessing their sins before him, seeking the forgiveness and mercy of God that he offers, but even to the Gentile nations who are now promised to become a part of this and have been for the last 2,000 years. And the question then becomes, what do we then do when we carry out this mission of bringing God's temple presence, this nexus point of where heaven and earth meet, not only in Jesus when he, or as it was in Jesus when he was upon the earth, but it continues to through us as he is now seated at the right hand of the Father, ruling over the cosmos, exercising all authority in heaven and on earth that is rightly his, right? So I could go on. We could study more on this, but we've, I think, went to the max of our hour-and-a-half time period. My hope and prayer, Lord Jesus, is that you would please make this ever more clear and appreciable in our minds, Lord, because if you don't, then how will we ever begin to understand it? Please help us to think on this, to chew on it more. Please let this ruminate in our minds and these flavors become all the more appreciated as we look deeper into these texts and as we continue to build upon these things in the future. We are thankful and grateful, Lord, that you are who you are, and you have invited us to be a part of all that you have opened up to us to become a part of. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Thanks for listening.